Okay, so first thing to note, your deadline is the Wednesday before the end of term. That is, I believe, the 27th of March. And it's going to be a 3 o'clock submission as per tomorrow. And again, you'll be submitting via Turnitin. So the link for Turnitin is on the ELLI page. If you click through to the assessments 2018-2019 section, all the submission details for all of your assessments are in there. So this module, this essay is going to be a bit longer, so you get a bit more word count to play with. 2,500 words, 60% of your module grade. And here's how it's going to work. I'm going to ask you to include an introduction, a collection of 3 linked thought pieces, in which you discuss at least one of the leadership practices that we have talked about in the course of this module. And we'll talk about this a bit more, so if it's not making sense yet, don't panic, okay? This is just the structure and the conclusion. And then you've got your appendix, which is the leadership resolutions. I'm asking you to write 2 or 3 short leadership resolutions that is going to be informing your leadership practice as you move on for this module. So this is it. It's as flexible an assignment as I can possibly make it. And I want that flexibility because I want you to be able to take this wherever it's going to make most impact for you. So you could choose at least 1, maybe 3 of any of the leadership practices we've discussed this term. So we could start with self-leadership. You could go through to purpose, power, asking challenging questions, risk, and networking and facilitation. Those are the 7 leadership practices that we're talking about. You will have read and you will have encountered all of those contents by about 3 weeks' time. So after another 3 weeks, there's not going to be any new content. You will have had all of those 7 leadership practices, the lectures on those 7 practices. And the rest of the time, we're going to be looking at this idea of a thought piece and what that is, okay? So don't worry too much if it's not making too much sense now. I think you'll be fine. Each of these thought pieces is a piece of writing that links theory to practice in some way. So just as this assignment that you're writing right now on self-leadership, that is a thought piece on self-leadership. So when you're thinking about what is a thought piece, it's a way in which, a piece of writing in which you're relating theory to practice. It could be your practice, it could be the practice of a different leader, it could be anything. But it's a little bit more applied than just pontificating about theory for the sake of theory. I'm asking you to think about the implications of this reading that you're doing on self-leadership or on power for a particular aspect of leadership practice. So in other words, I suggest that you think of a leadership issue which resonates with you. So, and use that as the basis for your 3 thought pieces. So for example, you might take Brexit. You might take a movie that you've watched recently. Some people have written we talked about Tyrion and Game of Thrones today. Some people have written amazing assignments on Game of Thrones. You could write about your own experience of leading in any context. You could write about a character from history. You could write about a book that you've read. As long as it has some kind of leadership implications, as long as you're discussing people who are doing leadership things or your own experience from a leadership perspective, as long as you can bring in at least one of those leadership practices, self-leadership, purpose, power, challenging questions, risk, networking, facilitation. As long as you bring in at least one of those and you draw on the reading that you've done in the course of this module, that is absolutely fine. So if, as you've been going along through this module, you've made some notes about interesting leadership things that you've seen and done, maybe you've been to a film and you thought, oh, actually, that's kind of a leadership thing. There's loads of films out at the moment that have things to do with leadership. We could look at Aquaman and Bumblebee as examples of kind of superhero mythology and the implications of that for leadership. We could take Colette, the movie with Keira Knightley, and think about how she's asking challenging questions about gender norms in society. We could take The Favourite and think about the role of the monarchy and forms of power in society. You could take any of these things. But we can also use your own reflections, things that we've thought about when you hear guest speakers talk. So we've got a reading week next week, but then after that, next week, Paddy, who is an ex-RAF fighter pilot, is coming to talk to us. He's going to talk about living with risk as a leader. So that might provide some interesting reflections for leadership. I'm going to invite you guys to think of some useful questions for Paddy. So if you've ever wanted to ask a fighter pilot anything, now is your chance. I'm going to put a virtual pin board up on Ellie so you guys can get thinking about what you might like to ask. Okay, so let's think about this. What is a thought piece? A thought piece is a reflexive, theoretically informed piece of writing which explores the leadership practice covered during this module. That is all it is. It is the same as what you are doing right now for self-leadership. So you guys, I'm always pretty confident by the time we get to this stage that you guys are going to do well in this assessment because you've already started work writing a thought piece. You kind of know what I'm expecting. You know I'm expecting you to think about a particular leadership issue and identify how the theories fit with whatever is going on. So it's going to show me your understanding of a particular aspect of leadership practice, one of those 7 that are framing the content for this module. You can base a thought piece on practice by linking them to all kinds of different topics. So you can talk about a challenge that you experienced. Maybe it's a challenge that required self-leadership, but also required you to act on purpose. Maybe it also required you to take risks. Well, there's your 3 thought pieces right there, right? Self-leadership, purpose, and risk. You could talk about a specific leadership practice, but from 3 different angles. Quite a lot of people do this with power. So for example, if you take a leadership challenge, it could be anything, it could be Trump's leadership, and you take power and you say, well, actually last week we talked about 3 different ways of looking at power. We talked about individual resources of power, we talked about organization sources of power, and we talked about societal forms of power. Well, there's your 3 thought pieces right there. So it's really up to you whether you want to focus on one of these practices in depth, like power, and look at it from 3 different ways, or you're going to choose some other focus for the whole assignment, but explore 3 different practices. So for example, you might say, okay, well, I'm going to take a series of novels that I've really enjoyed and explore the leadership practices in 3 different ways. Maybe I'm going to look at networking, facilitation, and asking challenging questions. So anything that where you've had a question about leadership is really useful. So for example, what is the function of leadership in society? That's kind of an interesting topic for an assignment. And it might you could write 3 thought pieces and different perspectives about that. As long as they mention one practice, where you take this is up to you. That is the only kind of must do, is you must relate to at least one leadership practice, because I need there to be some module content in there to be able to evaluate your work. And you must include that appendix on leadership resolutions. And other than that, what you choose to write about is entirely up to you. So I've put these on the board again because sometimes people forget which ones they are. So I'm including them there, but it's kind of obvious because every time we come and we get together every Tuesday afternoon, we talk about a different leadership practice. So those that have been the focus of these particular lectures are the different 7 leadership practices that I'd like you to pick amongst. So let's think about a thought piece a little bit more. Usually, a thought piece is a reasonably short piece of work that weaves apparently real-life issues with theoretical ideas and your own viewpoint. And that's kind of what you've done in your first assignment here. So you've taken self-leadership theory and sense-making, You've applied it to a particular issue, your own experience in this case, but it could be, you know, the story of a character in a book or whatever. As long as they have an experience that relates to leadership, that's fine. And then you kind of come at it with your own perspective. So you kind of think, okay, well, what does this tell me about leadership? What do I learn about leadership from thinking about it like this? Maybe it's offering a different viewpoint or shedding different light on leadership compared to what I thought about in the past. So ideally, each thought piece should help me understand how your engagement with this particular issue is clarifying or developing your understanding of what leadership is. So what are you getting out of writing this? Why does it matter? Why have you chosen to write about this? Why is it significant? What is the point of this piece of writing? So, in other words, it's about what is changing for you as a result of having done this module, as a result of thinking about leadership in these different ways. How are your thoughts on doing leadership changing? So that's quite a nice way to either conclude the whole assignment. Some people prefer to keep that till the end, and the conclusion, summarize by saying, okay, here's what I've got out of this. I think about leadership differently now, and this is how that change has happened. And some people prefer to summarize at the end of each thought piece, and that's fine too. It really, really doesn't matter, as long as you engage in that reflective process of, okay, well, I've done this reading, I've thought about this character from this film, or I've thought about this historical leader, and here's what I kind of have learned from doing this. So I've summarized here. I'm not going to spend time reading all this out now, because you can go and check this out for yourself, but I'm using here the standard business school grading criteria for this level. And it kind of tells you what kind of characteristics I'm going to expect in an essay with a really strong grade. So those of you who are really ambitious for yourselves in this module, double check this. At the end, towards the end of term, we will spend a lot more time thinking about, okay, what does a first look like? What does a 2-1 look like? I'm not going to share examples because I think it's too easy that way to tell you what to think, not how to think. But I will give examples of sentences. I will give, explain why I think this kind of sentence is going to do really well and get you additional marks. This kind of sentence needs development. So as we move through the rest of the term, we'll be doing a lot more work on how we improve the quality of your work generally. So if you're not sure how to structure this essay, here's my piece of advice to you. And it is, rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to pick 3 different events and discuss 3 different leadership practices and then manage to tie it all together at the end, you're asking quite a lot of yourself by doing that. What I suggest you do is give your 3 thought pieces a theme. That means that together your assignment kind of holds together well. So for example, if you're going to write 3 thought pieces on power, you've got a really obvious theme. The theme is power. That's going to be the thing that holds your essay together, right? But you could choose something else. Maybe you want to take an experience of your own as the theme for your work. And then you can talk about 3 different practices. So maybe you have had an adventure, maybe you've done some adventurous training and it changed your perspective on leadership. Maybe it revolved around risk, purpose, and, I don't know, sense-making, something else. You only need to do at least 1 practice. So there you've got 3 thought pieces, 1 on risk, 1 on purpose, 1 on sense-making, all of which relate back to the singular experience that you have. It's much easier. You save word counts by not having to describe a different context every time. Does that kind of make sense? So you can talk in your introduction about the situation, and then as you go through each of your thought pieces, you can start to weave in different kinds of theory that help shed different aspects of light onto your experience. So maybe by looking at power, it helps you understand a certain aspect of that experience. Maybe by looking at risk in a different thought piece, it helps you understand a different aspect of that same experience. So you can focus on one story, an event, and use that as a basis for each of your 3 thought pieces, which might consider a different leadership practice or whatever, but still focus on one experience or common thread. Or you take one practice, like I said, you take power, or you take risk, or you take self-leadership, and you explore that from 3 different perspectives. So you might say, okay, well, I'm going to take the story of, I don't know, who's the most unlikely leader? Kim Kardashian. You could write someone has actually done that in the past. They wrote a blinding essay on Kim Kardashian's leadership. We can debate how effective she is a leader, but she certainly has a lot of followers on Instagram. And this was the purpose of this whole essay, was to kind of unravel some of that complexity, looking at networking, social media networks, looking at purpose, looking at power. Kim Kardashian has a huge amount of influence on people. So you can see how you can focus on one individual, looking at it from different perspectives, or you can focus on one practice and then explore different kinds of phenomena at play in that leadership practice. So for example, you could have one on self-leadership. You could have one on sense-making. It was probably not very wise to have self-leadership and sense-making in this same thing together, because you just have to repeat yourself from the previous essay. But you could have one on self-leadership. You could have one talking about leading in crisis in relation to self-leadership. We talked about that today. You could talk about one on making change in your life, going back to self-leadership. All of those things would work really well. So it's up to you to think about how these thought pieces are going to be tied together so that the overall piece of work is coherent and that you can bring it together in the conclusion and say, well, actually, the focus of this whole piece of work is this. Okay? So let's think about some examples here. So if we took power, you could look at the 2016 Trump-Clinton election campaign. You could take a different theory of power in each thought piece and unravel those and explore how they are functioning and how they help you understand different aspects of that moment in time. So can you see how each thought piece might help you address or explore a different aspect of power that you could relate back to this scenario? You could take a leadership experience of your own, and in your 3 thought pieces you could discuss 3 different practices. You could take an analysis of a character from Game of Thrones and examine one practice over 3 thought pieces from 3 different angles. Or you could discuss 3 practices in depth, each one in a different thought piece. Let's do 2 more. You could have an analysis of a leader from history, drawing on the 3 most important practices that you can see in their leadership. Or you could evaluate risk from 3 different separate leadership contexts. Am I giving you some ideas or some examples here that kind of make sense? Yeah, it's challenging. It's hard to think about this because this requires you to do the thinking, doesn't it, in terms of thinking about what you're going to write about and what resonates most with you. So it's a challenging essay, but the reason I set it is because I don't think it has any bearing on your potential as a leader unless the subject resonates with you. So if I just set an essay for you, some of you might think, okay, that's relevant to me and I can learn something from it. And some of you, it's just going to be another assignment that you're going to have to do without actually learning anything about how to be a better leader. Hopefully, by doing it this way, by having to really think about what the implications for your practice are and having the freedom to choose like this, you have more of a chance of being able to choose something that you can take with you, that you can learn from. One of the things that some people find quite difficult is thinking about how to integrate this as a whole. So if you've got to write 3 different bits, how do you make it look coherent as a full 2,500 word assignment? And my advice on this is to remember that it is one assignment and not just write 3 different assignments. And the way that you can do that is to show in the introduction and in the conclusion how your issues are kind of connected. So if you have a common theme, like you're writing about the same leader for each one, that's not hard to do, right? You know, it's kind of obvious. But if you're writing about something which is a little bit vaguer, so say you're writing about vision, and you'd want to explore 3 different visions, you're going to have to explain how they are connected, or what do they have in common? They might have in common that they all changed the world, or one of them failed and 2 of them succeeded, and you want to compare and contrast because that's where the learning is. But you've got to be able to demonstrate that the 3 thought pieces I'm reading kind of follow on, they connect together in some way, they have something in common that helps you understand leadership a bit better. So how are you going to do this? Your introduction and your conclusion are really helpful here. They're where you kind of explain in the beginning what you're going to focus on in this essay and which aspects you're going to discuss in which thought piece. And then in your conclusion is where you tie it back into all together and say, well, actually, you know, I've compared it from these 3 different angles, and here's what I'm learning. Here's what I'm going to take forward for myself when I'm a leader. So subheadings, feel free to use subheadings at the start of each thought piece. Think about how you might connect thought pieces using linking sentences. So at the end of your first thought piece, you can say, okay, well, this has helped me understand question X, but in my second thought piece, I'm going to explore it from a different angle. So what that does is it gives your writing a really nice flow and structure. It helps the reader to understand what's coming next. These like linking sentences, they act like signposts. So they tell me or whoever else is going to be reading or marking your work, what am I going to expect next? Where is this person taking me in their learning? And you can link this, as I said, your thought pieces in your introduction and your conclusion is going to be super helpful as a way of making sure that your kind of work is all connected together. You can explain how the issues are connected to each other. You can tell me why you think they're important to consider alongside one another. So what does this look like in your intro then? I suggest, and this is not a must do, I'm not going to take points off if you go over, if you know you've got 251 words, I'm not going to worry. But this is a suggested outline, okay? Keep it quite short. Tell me what you're going to be writing about, why you've chosen this. So why have you chosen this? This is a kind of personal issue to, you know, it's a personal essay. Nobody else is going to be writing the same thing as you, which means you've got to tell me why you've picked this. Why does it resonate with you? What is the structure of your work? So give me a bit of a clue as to the kind of way, the direction that I can expect your arguments and your ideas to take. And maybe, if you have room, think about telling me the implication. What do I need to know about this? What are you going to come up with in your conclusion? You don't have to tell me your whole conclusion, but just maybe make some suggestions about where you're going to end up with this work. And your conclusion is going to be the other big piece that's going to pull it together at the end, right? So here, again, you don't necessarily need many words. So I would imagine probably each thought piece might take you about 750 words. You've got 250 words for the intro, maybe 250 words for the conclusion. But what have you learned? What I'm going to be looking for is, okay, has this person reflected on this for their own practice? Are they going to has their understanding of leadership changed? How do your thought pieces help you make sense of leadership in some way? So this idea here around synthesize, we always look for synthesis in your work. Synthesis is your ability to bring together different ideas and perspectives, different readings, different arguments from the literature, different ideas that we've talked about in your lectures. That is synthesis, and it's evidence that you are able to assimilate material from different sources and explain how they compare and contrast, explain how they are implicated in one another, explaining whether or not they agree with one another or whether or not they are fundamentally opposed. So synthesis is about pulling something all together, bringing together all of the threads of the different ideas that you've read about and thinking about what they all mean together. So something that you might want to think about in your conclusion, if you're not sure how you kind of pull this together, is, well, taken together, how do these three thought pieces help you answer the question that we looked at briefly at the beginning of this lecture, which is, what does this mean for my understanding of leadership? What does this mean for my practice of leadership, both now and in the future? So has my understanding of leadership changed? Has it been reinforced? Do I feel, conviction that I'm right in understanding leadership, or has my perspective completely turned around? What does this mean? Am I going to do things differently now in leadership? So I thought I would give you one more example to leave with you guys today. And I've taken an example from a while back because I figured that you guys probably wouldn't write about something that was as long ago as 2011. So I don't know, you might write about Winston Churchill, that's fine, but I don't think you would have picked this. So this is a thing that happened. I don't know if you guys remember this. You were kids probably when it happened. The MP expenses scandal. So this is something that happened in the UK, 2011. And it was discovered, there was a leak to a national newspaper called the Daily Telegraph. And they published the expenses claims made by all of our Member of Parliament under what was called the Second Homes Allowance. So under the rules, Members of Parliament were allowed to have a second home in London if the constituency where they reside, their representative, is a long way from London. So say you, I don't know, you have are an MP for somewhere in Northumberland in the northwest, northeast, and you have to travel down to London, and you need a place to stay in London, so you need a second home, right? They were allowed to claim expenses for things in their second homes, and those expenses were paid for by the taxpayer. So the Telegraph said, well, it's in our public interest to know what MPs are spending our tax money on in their homes. And MPs tried to hide this for a very long time. They were like, they didn't want to be released. They thought it wouldn't be fair. They felt that it wasn't okay to do. But eventually the Telegraph leaked this material, and it was discovered that many of these Members of Parliament were using this system of claiming expenses to claim thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds on all kinds of really expensive furniture, on new gardens, on ridiculous amounts of really expensive stuff. And they were accused, there was an uproar at the time. People were accusing them of working the system, but they were like, well, we've only played according to the rules. The rules allow us to pay off things from our expenses if we have to buy furniture for a new home because we live a long way from the Houses of Parliament. But some people were discovered to have behaved illegally. So there were some people who were discovered to have paid their mortgage off using taxpayers' money, which wasn't illegal. Some people were discovered to have used this money to pay for a cleaner, which wasn't necessarily all that legal. Some people were claimed to have, there was one very famous one where a guy had decided to build a duck pond in his garden, and it cost something like £15,000 to build a duck pond. Not necessary in a house. It's not like a fridge that you can't really live without. This is a duck pond that cost a lot of taxpayers' money. So among these people was the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He paid his brother nearly £7,000 to clean his house. Not quite sure about that. Gordon Brown responded by trying to launch an alternative system on YouTube. Didn't really work very well. People didn't receive it very well. David Cameron, who was at the time the leader of the Conservatives, he decided that he would publish his own MP's details on the internet. So he said, I think we should be transparent. I'm going to take action and publish it on the web. So we can see already that leaders are having different responses to this issue. Okay, we can debate whether or not they were very fair or reasonable. Some people resigned because they were found to have behaved immorally or unethically. Some people actually got charged and had to end up facing prison sentences. But interestingly, the guy with the duck pond always sticks in my mind because he was the recipient of a rather ingenious revenge attack. He woke up one morning and discovered that next to his marvellous duck pond, someone had planted wanker in daffodil bulbs in his garden, and I always think that's pretty genius. But anyway, so imagine we wanted to write about this. We wanted to write 3 thought pieces about this as a kind of basis for an essay. What kind of things could we talk about? I guess we could talk about power, right? We could talk about the different kinds of power and authority that members of parliament have. We could talk about the power that we invest in rules that tell us whether something's right or wrong. Another thought piece could be on asking challenging questions. So how do we hold people to account who behave unethically if we can see that they're actually behaving within the rules? Is it okay as long as you don't break the rules? Maybe it is, I don't know. We could talk about risk. To what kind of risks were MPs taking when they realised that actually this stuff is probably going to be leaked at some point? People are going to find out what you're spending this money on. So you've got 3 different thought pieces that you could talk about in relation to this one issue. There are some questions that might help us think critically. So what about, do democratically elected people always act in the interests of their electorate? We elect them on the basis of trust, right? They're going to do their best for us. We believe them, that's why we elect them. But does that mean that necessarily they're going to be the right people to do the job? What about having a system of rules? Does that mean that leaders act fairly? Does that prevent us from being corrupt or from doing things wrong? How should we judge the success of leaders? What counts ultimately as a good leader? Is it somebody who is ethical or somebody who's effective? The more you think about some of these questions, the harder they get to answer. So I've given you a few questions that might help us think about ways to analyse and think critically about different angles of approach into some of these issues. Some people find it helpful to write mind maps. So if you have a particular issue, say you wanted to write something about something more recent in the news. Let's think, we could talk about Article 50. Or Donald Tusk versus Theresa May. I think that's plenty to write about on that front. There's loads of stuff going on in the news at the moment around Brexit, but you could talk about all kinds of other things. So you could put Brexit or Theresa May or Donald Tusk in the middle of your mind map and then write out different ideas and questions that are going to help you to think about where you and how you structure your thought pieces and the kinds of direction that you might use. Or maybe you say, right, I'm going to write about this MP's expensive scandal, but all of my 3 thought pieces are going to be on challenging questions. Because ultimately that's the point of this whole process, of the whole process of the leak, was to enable people to ask questions. Rather than having it all closed and hidden, it's allowing people to hold leaders to account in certain ways. So maybe we need to think about followers in a different way. Okay, so designing a thought piece. Here are some ideas for how you might start thinking about this. What leadership stories have you experienced personally? Have you read about in the news? Have you seen in a film recently? How do they relate to these leadership practices? So when I started talking at the start of term about this, and I was saying, think about the leadership that you are exposed to every day. This is why. Because it's going to help you see where people are taking risks, where people are acting on purpose. So I suggest that I'm not going to make you do any more today. You've sat for long enough. But I suggest that you mull over some of these ideas, Don't forget that I'm going to give you next week to think about this, to write a plan. Use that time wisely, please, and do email me if you have any questions. This will be on recap.